welcome. I'm Brooke Heffright. I'm the director of CINA at George Mason University. CINA stands for Criminal Investigation and Network Analysis, and we are a DHS Center of Excellence here at George Mason. I'm pleased to welcome you to another installment of CINA's Distinguished Speaker Series. Our speaker today is Colton Seale. Colton is founder and principal consultant of Pyxis Academy, and his talk is titled Interviewer Mindset. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize and thank CINA's program management team at the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate, Office of University Programs. That's Jen Foley and Sue Newman for their support for this talk and for the rest of CINA's Distinguished Speaker Series. Now, just a note about this series, CINA has an active program of scientific outreach, and we do almost weekly events to expose different audiences to CINA-sponsored research. However, the Distinguished Speaker Series is a bit different in that it is an opportunity for CINA to showcase interesting speakers from academia, government, and industry for our mainly DHS audience. And in all cases, the distinguished speakers are presenting previous research that was not conducted under CINA's cooperative agreement or contract vehicle. Now, before we get started, a few words about CINA for the new folks joining us today. CINA's mandate is to advance DHS and the U.S. government's mission to counter transnational organized crime. DHS Centers of Excellence are managed by DHS S&T Directorate's Office of University Programs and led by a university to conduct groundbreaking research resulting in rigorous, objective knowledge products and timely solutions for DHS components. CINA's research themes include criminal network analysis, dynamic patterns of criminal activity, both traditional forensics and cyber forensics, and criminal investigative processes. And Colton's talk today fits very well into our fourth bucket, criminal investigative processes. CINA is supported by a DHS board of directors who help us to ensure the relevance of our research and identify champions and funding for transition. So if you're excited by what you hear today and think that research can help your component's mission, visit our website at cina.gmu.edu to join our mailing list. Now, today's talk is special because CINA developed and publicized it jointly with our new partner, FBI's High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, or the HIG, in the Counterterrorism Division at FBI. Unfortunately, the director of the HIG, Robin Ayler, couldn't be with us today, but she asked me to say a few words on her behalf. Robin expressed appreciation to CINA for this valuable partnership and Colton for his willingness to participate. Robin noted that Colton was her first true introduction to the HIG many years ago, and she said that his knowledge and experience brought her to a place of realization that she knew that this was the right way, and he gave it structure and meaning. Robin said she'd argue that Colton is largely responsible for putting her on the path which has culminated her in having the honor of leading the HIG today. She also asked me to share with the whole audience that the HIG's appreciation to the attendees to extend the HIG's open invitation for HIG support, which includes occasional requests for proposals in dealing with complex human problems. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker, Colton Seale. Colton retired from the FBI after 22 years as a special agent, finished his career as an interrogation team leader and head of training for an elite interagency interview and interrogation team that is the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, the HIG. As a supervisory special agent, Colton began his career in the Anchorage Division, conducting nearly every type of investigation covered by the FBI and thousands of interviews. After Anchorage, Colton transitioned to the FBI's Counterterrorism Division fly team and spent 6 years mostly overseas conducting interrogation of terrorism subjects and recruiting and handling confidential human sources. A significant portion of this time was spent in Pakistan, including playing a central role in interviews related to the operations directed against the leaders of al-Qaeda. After the fly team, Colton moved to the HIG and brought together research on interviewing and interrogation, what they call I&I, to create the first truly research-based I&I training program in the U.S. intelligence community. In this capacity, Colton trained thousands of students from the U.S. intelligence community, our Five Eye partners, and other foreign partners. Colton worked closely with the FBI and the Five Eyes partners to restructure their I&I training to align with the HIG's protocols. And for all these efforts, in 2019, Colton was awarded the FBI Director's Award for Excellence in Training and also awarded the National Intelligence Meritorious Unit Citation for conducting interviews of high-value subjects. After he retired, Colton founded the Pixis Academy, which applies the science of interviewing, interpersonal communication, and deception detection with an array of private, public, and individual clients to help them engage more effectively in challenging conversations and situations for the purpose of gathering accurate and actionable information. Most recently, Colton has spent most of the last year in the Middle East working with a confidential client to improve the efficacy of their analytic process as applied to the recent turmoil in the region. So with that, please join me in welcoming Colton Seale with his talk, Interviewer Mindset. Over to you, Colton.
All right. Thank you so much. I was thinking this morning, I'm in New Hampshire now, and there's a well-known singer right now from New Hampshire, Noah Kahan. And in one of his songs, there's a line that says, "Son, why do you do this to yourself?" And I spend months preparing for a talk like this, and I love it. And then the morning of it, suddenly I feel all the stress and the nervousness, and I wonder, why do I do this to myself? Right? But getting in front of a group of accomplished professionals, putting yourself out there in front of them, that's stressful, right? And I'm really excited to be here, and we're going to talk about that stress some today and how we best manage it, because interviewing itself, fun as it is, can be stressful. So early 1999, I was a brand new FBI agent, and I had my creds, my badge, my gun, and a head full of everything I learned at Quantico. I thought I was pretty cool. And I was certain that given all this, people would tell me the stuff that I wanted to know. But a couple weeks after arriving at my first office, I'm assigned a kidnapping case. An absentee father had taken his 9-year-old daughter, a daughter who'd never really met him. So I went to interview the mom, and she told me all the details I needed to know about the kidnapping itself. That was all good. Then I asked her to tell me everything about the father and her relationship with him. That was not all good. Right? She basically shut down and said it was irrelevant. Right? It was very relevant to me because I needed to really know who he was if I was going to understand the situation and to track him down and bring the daughter back. So my investigative mindset was in the right place, but my interviewer mindset was not. Right? Everyone has a reason not to want to talk to us, even when it seems in their interest to talk to us. Right? And our job is to pay attention to the subtext of what they're saying, to recognize and then avoid those points of resistance. I was young and naive, and I ran smack into her reason, right? Her reason not to want to talk to me. And it very much was about my mindset, right? This was going to be an easy conversation for me. I was really excited to get on solving a kidnapping, right? But it was going to be a very difficult conversation for her. I didn't recognize that because I was stuck in my perspective, right? She was going to have to relive a past of sex and drugs and abuse and the like. She did not want to relive that, and she certainly didn't want to do so with a perfect stranger, a stranger who had done nothing to make this a safe conversation. And I imagine each of you have been in a similar situation where it made perfect sense to you that someone would want to share information with you, and yet they weren't sharing it. So in talking about interviewers' mindset today, I want to look at how we can keep those relatively easy situations from going sideways, and how we can better navigate the difficult situations and turn those into opportunities, right, by helping people to the place of wanting to talk to us, right? Bad guys included in that. So I spent the first almost 10 years of my FBI career in the FBI's Anchorage division, and I discovered that more than my dogs even, I loved interviewing and talking to people, and I got to do it multiple times a day, sometimes 8 to 10 interviews a day. Annoyingly, what I was figuring out was that what we were taught at Quantico and other courses was essentially the opposite of everything that seemed to work in real life. So we're taught one thing, but it turns out the opposite thing is actually what works. Right? That was really frustrating. And at the time, I didn't have the understanding of psychology that I do now, nor did I have the research to back that feeling up that I do now, but I had figured out some basics. And at the heart of that was treating other people as if they're human beings, right? Human beings with feelings, hopes, desires, aspirations, worries, fears, and so forth, and to listen to them, right? Rather than trying to convince people to confess or to tell you what you want to hear, just ask good, open-ended questions and listen, right? listen to them, reflect back what you are hearing, and let them make the decision to talk to you. And so I later learned that that was autonomy, a rather key principle, but at the time it just felt right and seemed to work. So let me give you an example. So in 2003, 21-year-old Bethany Carrera was murdered in Anchorage. Or at the time she was missing, but we assume she was murdered. That's Bethany on the right, and on the left is Sonia Ivanoff and Mindy Schloss, two other murder cases I was working at the same time. So fun couple of years. But we had two subjects related to Bethany, brothers Michael and Robert Lawson. And we surmised that Michael had killed Bethany and Robert had helped to hide the body. But we had no solid evidence and we had no body. So we didn't have enough to charge them with murder, but I was able to indict them on about $1 million in fraud related to their business. So a case I'm still proud of. But after we arrested them, I sat down with Robert and explained to him the situation, right, being indicted for fraud, and the basic components of that indictment. I read him his rights. And then I asked him about his life. And I shut up and listened, right? I showed interest in what he was saying, and I showed some empathy relative to the struggles he'd had with his brother throughout their lives. But mostly I listened, and within about 45 minutes, he just stopped and said, "I'll tell you where Bethany is." And he did. Right? I did nothing to try to get him to tell me about her. I let him figure out why he was really there, and then let him make the decision on his own to talk to me about it. Right? I didn't try to tell him what a good guy I thought he was, or how I was sure it was all a tragic mistake, or whatever other nonsense. I listened to him, reflected back what he was saying, and let him make that decision. And when we tell someone what kind of person they are, or why they acted as they did, we create resistance. When we listen to what they're telling us about themselves and generate understanding, we create cooperation and a willingness to communicate. So the whole Alaska experience was pretty fantastic, but after almost 10 years, it was time for a change. And in 2009, I got lucky and was accepted onto the FBI's Counterterrorism Division fly team. So a group of agents and analysts who forward deployed to hotspots and basically war zone kind of places around the world to collect intelligence and evidence. Our job was to go to these far-flung places and to make friends with people who very often didn't want to be our friends, and to gather useful information from them. So I spent the next 6 years all over the world interviewing terrorists, responding to terrorist attacks, and collecting evidence. And as the map kind of shows here, absolutely the best job ever. Also in 2009, the year that I went to the fly team, President Obama was trying to figure out what to do about enhanced interrogation. And he created a task force to look at what we know about interrogation. And the answer was basically that we knew nothing, right? The government had done no research on interrogation since around the Korean War. And basically what we were being taught was just folk wisdom, not science. So via an executive order, President Obama created the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, the HIG, an interagency organization comprised of FBI, CIA, and DoD, to conduct the research to develop rapport-based techniques to gain accurate intelligence from terrorists. That is, to figure out how do we have difficult conversations with people who do not want to talk to us and gain from them accurate and actionable information. So the HIG was also tasked with leading the interrogations of high-value detainees. And it turned out that my first fly team deployment was actually as a HIG interrogator. Right? So interviewing a guy named Faisal Shahzad who tried to blow up Times Square and very nearly succeeded, except for I think he used the wrong kind of fertilizer, but he was close. So President Obama had just created the HIG when this happened, and he said, send my team, the HIG, up there. And nobody wanted to tell the president that, well, your team is about 4 people right now, and none of them are interrogators. So boss walks over to my pod and says, Colton, you're now the HIG interrogator, go up to New York. And if you ever worked with the New York field office, you can imagine how much fun that was. But why I mention this is because we talked to Shahzad for 7 days, developing trust and gaining good intelligence, until an NYPD cop who happened to be part of the team that day decided to get in Shahzad's face and yelled at him about some inconsequential detail. which was whether Shahzad had gone to Boston or Braintree, Massachusetts to get some money. And Boston and Braintree are right next to each other. They're about the exact same thing, but unfortunately, that resulted in a yelling match, and that shut Shahzad down, right? He hasn't talked to anybody since then. It took 5 minutes of this guy yelling at Shahzad to undo 7 days of work. Right? So that NYPD guy had the wrong mindset, right? For him, it was about winning a pointless argument and thinking he could win by beating Shahzad down and telling him what a freaking liar he was, right? Still frustrated about that. But during this trip, I began to understand better what the HIG was doing with research. And it was still early, but they were beginning to show why some things worked and when they worked. It was easy to see already that this was going to be revolutionary, right? And I began to adapt it into my overseas interviews. So in 2011, I was in Pakistan, and we'd done the raid on the bin Laden compound, and the wives were brought back to Islamabad, and I was tasked with coordinating and leading those interviews with the wives. And my previous inclination on how to approach them would have been first to sympathize with them, right? And then apologize for what had happened, and then try to convince them to talk, right? That would have been aligned with what I'd been taught. But instead, I kind of revised that plan, and we explained to them that we recognized their situation was difficult, but we did not apologize. We didn't have anything to apologize for. Rather, we were quite direct about what had happened and why it happened, and then what we wanted to talk to them about. And then we were just quiet. Right? The plan came directly from my understanding of the HIG research at the time, and it worked. Right? They were quiet for quite some time, rather, but then they started talking. Right? They didn't want our apologies. They didn't want our sympathy. They wanted to know if they could trust us. And generating that affective trust comes through mindset. Right? And through them, right, we were able to piece together what their lives had looked like since 9/11, and so forth. It wasn't perfect, but we did get a lot. I'm convinced the revised start made all the difference. And unfortunately, I didn't get to finish those interviews because I got pulled off to lead a second team to bin Laden's compound, which was kind of cool, fun story, but story for another time. And so finally in 2014, I was asked by the director of the HIG to actually move over to the HIG to organize all of the research they'd sponsored into coherent methodology and to figure out how to implement and train that methodology. And ultimately I said yes. The letting go of the fly team was really hard. But now I got to travel the world to meet with the researchers to figure out what the research really meant and how it all fit together, and what we were missing, what gaps we needed to fill in the research. And I learned some cool things, right? Like everything we'd been taught about deception detection was wrong. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that now. Unfortunately, it took us another several years to know what right looked like, but we got there. Rapport has nothing really to do with small talk at the beginning of an interview. Right? That's basically a waste of your time. So rapport is a much deeper and complicated idea than that. And back to something I said earlier, all the themes we've been taught to offer people are really as likely, if not more likely, to shut them down than to open them up. So going back to my early days in Anchorage, where it felt like everything I'd been taught was making things worse, now I was getting evidence to back up that feeling. Right? Literally more often than not, the opposite of what we've been taught was what really worked. And as I pulled all the research into a coherent system and began to use it and train it, I quickly realized that it wasn't just about talking to terrorists. Right? It was about how we most effectively interact with other people. Right? It's about talking to anyone, right? Victims, witnesses, subjects, really anyone. And I also realized that it wasn't all about the science. Right? The science is absolutely critical, but also there's an art to it. And that art is the interviewer's mindset. And I think that too often gets overlooked. Right? Applied clinically or insincerely, the research-based methodology just didn't have the same impact as when applied by a truly skilled interviewer. And skilled interviewing results from an ethos, a mindset, right? Not just from the science. And this part's important to me. It definitely does not result from a toolkit. Right? It's not about a toolbox. Right? The wrong mindset is believing that if you can pull enough, hammers, screwdrivers, wrenches, etc., out of a toolbox, it'll work out. Right? If anyone knows how tools actually work, they will know that is the wrong mindset. Right? When I need a wrench, throwing a hammer at the problem is not going to solve it. And to me, this is key. So let's step back and think about it for a minute. So think for a minute, what's the difference between a chef and a cook? A chef creates something and can create something, amazing regardless of the conditions. So I had a chef friend who could create a 5-star meal on a camp stove, and I've watched him do it. Right? The tool didn't matter, the context didn't matter. What mattered was his approach to cooking and the intuitive understanding he gained from years of practice. Right? A cook, on the other hand, is beholden to the tools, recipes, and specific processes. Right? A cook struggles to adapt, while a chef fluidly adapts. Right? So a chef has a growth mindset. Right? I can do this regardless, and I can always adapt and get better. And a cook has a fixed mindset. I'm limited by the situation, by the tools I have, and by the script. So traditional interrogation methods tend to follow rigid step-by-step procedures, right? Consistent with a fixed mindset. The old methods, they rely on predefined actions and specific responses at specific times. So basically they're inflexible and lacking in adaptability. Now, in contrast, right, the modern approaches, evidence-based approaches, represent a shift toward a growth mindset. Skilled interrogators recognize their role as dynamic and adaptable. Right? They understand that successful interviewing requires not only a foundation of knowledge, but also the ability to apply that knowledge flexibly, right? Considering the individual being interviewed and the context in which they're operating. And a skilled interviewer is a gatherer of information. Right? They're not fact checkers, and they're definitely not confession seekers. Right? With an ethos of seeking accurate information, the confessions will come when needed, right? About 20% more often than with an accusatory approach. But our mindset should be about gathering information, right? Finding root causes and seeing the bigger picture. Now, how does this make sense in the grander scheme? Why did it come to be? And what's coming next? So when we focus on those questions, we gather more and more accurate intelligence. And yeah, we also get the confessions. So based on the research and based on the thousands of interviews I've done and the hundreds more I've watched, I see three critical components to developing an interviewer's mindset. First is self-awareness, right? Know yourself, know what drives you, and know what sets you off, right? What annoys you or even angers you. Second is confidence. Confidence is critical to mindset, but we'll talk about the right and the wrong kinds of confidence and what leads to the right confidence. And third, genuine curiosity. Put simply, be interested, not interesting. This seems obvious, but our minds always want to move towards certainty and away from the uncertainty that true curiosity can bring. So it's harder than it seems. And all of this might seem obvious, but they're not as easy as they sound, because in the face of a difficult interview, it's astonishing how quickly they fly out the window and we revert to pressuring and accusatory approaches, right? Wrong mindset approaches, even when we know those aren't the way to go. So let's talk first about self-awareness. Right? Self-awareness is about understanding what drives you and how you act or react in different situations and why. All right, that is reflecting on who you are and why you are who you are and how you are. Right. Problem here is that each of us believes we are uniquely and supremely self-aware, right? That we are the one autonomous, self-reflective, aware individual in a flock of billions of sheep. That might sound a little bit hyperbolic, but if you think about it for a minute, I think you will find that it's true. Right? Have a look at the people on the screen or around you in general. And at some point, you'll come to that feeling that I clearly know myself better than they know themselves. And that's normal. We all feel that, right? This is known as naive realism, and we all suffer from it. We all believe that we aren't affected by our emotions, our past experiences, our culture, or all the natural cognitive biases that get in our way every day, right? We believe we assess situations objectively and make rational, calculated decisions based on the facts. All right, we don't. Like it or not, you have a human brain and it functions just like a human brain. And it reacts to situations based on your systems of beliefs and values, which function at the subconscious level. And that system is created by our past experiences and our culture and all those other things. Right? So every bit of information you take in passes in your brain through the filters that are basically your system of beliefs and values. So your existing beliefs and values interpret the world and tell you how to react to what is being said to you or what is going on. Right? We don't receive objective reality. We receive what our brain interprets. And that system of beliefs and values, which is interpreting the incoming messages, tells us how to react to any given situation. So unless we short circuit that system, we're not in charge of it, and we're just reacting. We're not responding or engaging. So there is a way to overcome this, but first let me give you a quick example of what I'm talking about. So during the Times Square investigation I mentioned earlier, one of my teammates was interviewing one of the co-conspirators who'd been detained in Islamabad. At one point, my mate asked the detainee why he had the Times Square webcams loaded onto his computer. And the guy answered, because I wanted to watch Americans die. This clashed with my teammate's values, and he reacted in accordance with those values, getting viscerally angry at this guy. I'm sure we've all been there, right? Someone says something to us and you feel that immediate boil, and we respond based on that boil. And when we show someone that anger, right, we show that anger towards someone, we create resistance, right? As my colleague experienced, that interview had been going well, and it went nowhere from there because he wasn't aware of how he would respond to a provocative statement like that. So the point is, we're not always consciously aware of our values, so we're not aware of how they'll impact us and how that can lead to really less than optimal outcomes in an interview. And then we tend to rationalize our behavior rather than reflect on it and learn from it. Right? So how do we improve self-awareness? Right. Step one, consciously reflecting on our beliefs and values. Sounds easy, right? But think about it. When was the last time you stepped back and thought about what things do I feel are important? That is, what things do I value? And what do I believe? What truths about the world do I believe? And why do I believe and value these things? Right? Beliefs drive values, values drive our actions and reactions. So part of controlling for these in a difficult conversation is being aware of them. Right? If you don't spend time contemplating them, you can't control them. And to be clear, I'm not saying that what you believe and value is wrong, right? That's up to you. But if not reflected on and controlled, how those beliefs and values drive reactions in an interview, that can be wrong, right? For any of us. So reflection, introspection, and metacognition. And metacognition is thinking about our thinking, asking, why am I thinking this thing right now? And why do I believe this specific thing? Regular metacognition allows us to more consciously control potential negative or judgmental responses. And based on research, regularly reflecting on our thinking dramatically changes how we respond to stressful situations, right? And for the better, obviously. Second is mindfulness and mindful meditation. So real mindfulness allows us not to let things bother us. Right? This takes effort and practice, but research shows 10 to 20 minutes a day of mindful meditation can make a significant difference in how we respond to stressful situations. And as I alluded to at the very beginning, an interview is a stressful situation. You never know what is going to come out of someone else's mouth, right? You don't know what they're thinking. You have no access at all to their thoughts, right? You don't know where the interview is going to go. And you don't even know for sure what you're going to say next, right? All that combined is stressful. Right? So this isn't a course in mindful meditation, obviously, but I encourage you to look further into it for two reasons. So first, being mindful is central to the interviewer's mindset. Mindfulness is paying attention to and being engaged in the moment. You're not worried about what came before or what might yet come. You are present in the moment and engaged with the subject. Second, when those things come up that conflict with your beliefs and values, you can move your bad response aside before it comes out of your mouth and find the good response. Right? So, for example, I once had a subject say, I killed her because I felt like it and because it was fun. Right? My initial emotion-based response would have been something along the lines of, you fucking thought it was fun, right? Not a helpful response. So instead, I was able to move that aside and respond more adaptively. Something, tell me what you mean by you felt like it, right? One response ends the conversation, the other continues it. And the interviewer's mindset is always about continuing the conversation to gain more information. But we can't always do that if we don't know ourselves and we haven't done the work to allow for better emotional regulation within stressful situations. And when we don't have the confidence to allow that second better response to come to us, the first response is what comes out of our mouth. That leads us to the second component of interviewer's mindset, confidence. So I want to put a caveat out here. By confidence, I don't mean that you should not have a plan, right? Confidence is not a plan or a strategy. Right? Nearly every interviewer I've heard say, don't worry, I've got this, in fact, did not have it. And I got to watch a train wreck of an interview. Right? So by confidence, I mean confidence in the skills that you have practiced and the science behind those skills, and the confidence that you can adapt to any situation by creatively applying the science, right? The confidence that you don't have to fall back onto old and unproductive techniques when something gets difficult. And the confidence that you can, in fact, use the science to find your way through even the most challenging situations. So, for example, if someone's verbally attacking you, right, telling you how much you suck, the right confidence allows you to overcome that desire to defend and attack back, and instead to move to the behavior that probably feels less intuitive in the moment, but you confidently know it to be the behavior that will drive the conversation forward. And I'm assuming here everybody's familiar now with Professor Allison's interpersonal behavior wheels. So if somebody's attacking and punishing, you move to frank and forthright. This mindset doesn't come easily because we don't practice it enough. So I find this bizarre, right? Technical skills we practice all the time, right? No one's going to go try to lift a latent print without first learning and practicing and understanding the most up-to-date ways to do that. And any law enforcement officer spends a lot of time learning how to properly use a firearm. Yet when it comes to interviewing, people seem willing to wing it, right? They have the wrong confidence. The idea that, I've got this because I possess the ability to make words come out of my mouth. So what possibly could go wrong? Right? And I don't understand why that is. Because interviewing, I think, is far and away the most difficult part of the job. Right? I've seen a few evidence failures, back in the day when we used to use tape to collect latent prints. I watched that tape turn into a ball of tape on a couple times. I've seen tactical failures. All of a sudden the gun is flying across the room to the feet of the bad guy. Not a good situation. But on the whole, right, I've only seen a handful of those. But with interviewing, I've seen a lot of failures, right? Even failures with what should have been relatively easy witnesses, right? So the confidence I'm talking about is the belief that our training and expertise and our skills that we have practiced will guide us to finding our way out of those difficult moments in a conversation, and they will do so without creating resistance in whoever we're talking to. Right, and that's important because most resistance from a subject comes from something we have said or done. Right, the interview becomes a bit challenging or confusing, and we get frustrated, and then we become demanding, judgmental, argumentative, patronizing, etc. All those things cause resistance because we're giving the person something to push back against. Right? All these negative behaviors come from the interviewer lacking the right kind of confidence. They may have the confidence that they can bulldoze their way through the interview, and they feel confident that if they maintain total control of the interview, they'll get what they want, but they lack the confidence to stay calm even when things are challenging, and they lack the confidence to recognize that they don't always have to be in control. It's being confident that you'll get to where you need to be even when you cede control of an interview for a while. So, how do we develop this confidence? Really simple, right? Training. We train our brain to know how to react appropriately in tough situations. So, through understanding the science behind interviewing and through pushing yourself out of your comfort zone to see what this type of interviewing looks like for you in difficult situations. And the difficult situation part is key. You don't get better practicing it over a beer with your mate. You get better practicing it out of your comfort zone in difficult situations. That's what trains your brain to be able to do it right in an interview. And what do I mean by right? What looks right for you? What right looks like for me is going to be different from what it looks like for you. Right? So think about it. How many of you grew up in Colorado as a cowboy, moved to San Diego and became a surfer, went to undergrad and ran track, got a graduate degree from the University of Chicago, and accidentally ended up in the FBI? I'm assuming none of you, right? None of you are me. I'm not you. So how the science works for you will be different than how it works for me because our personality plays a role in it. Right? So you have to practice it to know what it looks like for you and what it looks like for you in different situations. Right? Science-based interviewing is not a rote step-by-step method. You have to adapt it to who you are and do so with the right mindset. And when you understand the science and have practiced it, so you know what it looks like and feels for you, it gives the confidence to stay cool and deal with anything that comes at you during an interview. It gives you the confidence to recognize that you don't always have to be in control, right? To step back and let the interview go where it goes, knowing that ultimately it will end up where you need it to be because you have the ability to get it there without rigidly being in control of the entire interview. So at the Hig, one of my specialties became interviewing FBI informants who we were concerned about, right? Mostly it was about credibility assessment, but there was a lot more to it than that. So one day I'm interviewing this guy who meet with high-level officials for us in another country. And that is not the guy, bad form to put a picture of your informant on PowerPoint, so not the guy, but those look surprisingly like the hotel we were in. So anyway, I asked him about a specific event that had happened on one of his trips, and his answer had nothing to do with that event. Right? It was a long, rambling discussion about some seemingly random guy I'd never heard of, and it ended up with him questioning me about what would happen if he was arrested in the country he traveled to. So I'm sitting there alone with this guy in a hotel room, and I'm totally confused. Right? And I thought about stopping him and saying, what the hell, dude? What are you even talking about? Right? But instead, I decided, okay, you've got this, hopefully. Just be quiet, listen, and figure it out. I had the confidence that it would work out and that I didn't have to stop him. That I could work it out through listening. And it did work out. And it turned out the guy he was talking about was some high-ranking intelligence officer, and our informant was having an affair with that guy's daughter, right? Terrible idea. But I've been struggling for hours to understand what was missing from his narrative. And finally, I'd gotten him to a place where suddenly he was ready and felt safe talking to me about this. So he just launched into it, right? Completely ignoring whatever question I'd asked. Right? But had I pushed him earlier that his narrative made no sense, or had I stopped him and pointed out that whatever he was talking about had nothing to do with what I just asked, that would have created resistance, right? And he'd no longer felt safe sharing that information with me. I'd have lost the key piece of information we needed, although I had no idea what that piece of information was when I went into the room. Right? Not only did I have to be confident in just letting it go, I had to be confident that I could piece things together without pressuring. And I also had to want to find out what it was that I didn't know. Right? Remember, we're gatherers of information. And though I wasn't at all certain what we were talking about or why we were talking about it, I knew it was something new. And that had my curiosity piqued. What else could I find out? Which brings us to the third pillar, right? With self-knowledge and confidence, we have genuine curiosity. Right? And I don't believe I've ever had a conversation with anyone that went in a straight line, right? Conversations take turns, they go on tangents, and they go to unpredictable places. And we need the confidence to be okay with this. And even more so, we need the curiosity to follow those tangents. So if an interview has a script or an interviewer has a script and sticks to it, it's like being on a major highway that gets you from point A to point B. You basically know where it is you're going, and you know what to expect, and it just confirms your expectations, and not much curiosity needed, right? Just keep following the path. But a conversation, an actual conversation, is about taking the back roads and being open to finding and exploring the unexpected, and having the confidence and the curiosity to take those unexpected turns. Right? Some of those turns are going to be dead ends, and no worries, because others are going to produce gems of information. Right? And we don't find those gems if we're not curious. And I'm sure most everyone here is quite familiar with the idea of confirmation bias, right? Our natural tendency to look for and pay attention to information that supports our existing beliefs and to ignore information that does not support our beliefs. So we've put a lot of effort into developing those beliefs or theories, and thus we'd rather find information that supports them than contradicts them. And it's 100% natural to approach an interview with a preconception of what someone is going to tell us about, right? If we didn't have that, why would we even be talking to them? So it's natural, and it's a helpful part of our planning process. But once you're sitting down talking to someone, curiosity should take the lead. Right? What does this person know that I hadn't thought about? Or what might they be able to tell me that I didn't even know to ask about? When we look for and go beyond just confirming what we already know or believe, and look for those things we didn't even know to ask about, that's what makes for a great interview. So in Pakistan, I was interviewing a guy who'd been involved in several bombings. And when he'd been arrested in Pakistan, his leg had been injured in the process. So he wasn't very happy to begin with. And he definitely wasn't very happy about talking to me, right? The American guy. So he wasn't really engaging with me. And basically he was just sitting there staring at me. So, but he was sitting on a stool that was obviously causing his injured leg a lot of pain. So I went and got him a chair and helped him into that. And then I just asked him to tell me about what had happened to his leg. And he was angry about the leg, so he's willing to talk at least about that. But he wasn't psyched to talk about it, but he was at least willing to talk about it. And he told me he'd been at a tea shop reading, and all of a sudden, when he left, all of a sudden he was tackled by a bunch of guys who'd driven up on motorcycles. So he wasn't sure what was happening, so he fought back, and that's when one of the guys drove over his leg with a motorcycle. Then he was handcuffed, blindfolded, and taken to a secret Pakistani intelligence location where he was interrogated without his injury being treated. So I had to deal with the leg treatment issue because that's a human rights thing. But setting that aside, there was a lot to be curious about in his description of what had happened. Right? Think about it. Based on what he said, right? Tea shop, reading, attacked, fought back, run over, hooded, interrogated. Where would you start that conversation? So I went back to the start. I was reading in a tea shop. Right? I could have assumed that being a terrorist, he was just reading terrorist stuff, right? And totally ignored that seemingly pointless detail. But I was curious about why he'd started off by mentioning that he was reading. So I asked about it. And turns out he's reading a book by Karen Armstrong called The Battle of God, a book I'd actually read. And it's a discussion of what leads to religious extremism and doesn't necessarily paint a flattering picture of extremism, but it does present a pretty well thought out, nuanced approach. So I asked him what he thought about it. And there's absolutely no way I could have scripted this, right? He went from morose to suddenly and excitedly discussing the book and how it had impacted his life and caused him to question his choices. So we talked about that for at least an hour, probably more. And next thing I know, we're talking about him being in a terrorist training camp, exactly what I wanted to be talking about. which ultimately led us to identifying the location of lead IED maker in Pakistan. And also to find out that that IED guy was experimenting with biotoxins. And the biotoxin thing was not even a thing I would have known to ask about, right? Nowhere on my radar. And all of that came from being curious enough to ask about what he'd been reading. So still, even with the right mindset, every interview is not going to be perfect, right? You'll screw up and create resistance. But always striving to develop an information and truth-focused interviewer's mindset and operating with a growth mindset helps you get back on track. And the research does show that. So again, in Pakistan, I was interviewing this guy who was a top fundraiser for Al-Qaeda. And the interview started off pretty well. We were talking about Afghanistan and some stuff there. But then I started pushing him on a trip he'd taken to Saudi to meet with some high-level Pakistanis to coordinate fundraising and potential attacks. And he says, I've never been to Saudi. So I showed him his passport with the Saudi stamp. And he said, no, that's not me. I've never been to Saudi. So I started to get really frustrated because the thing was, he had a gigantic scar across his face, right? This picture does not even do justice to the scar that this guy had. It was full on across his face. And the photo was of him with the same giant scar, right? So I pointed that out, and he responded, nope, doesn't even look like me. I'm sure everybody's been in a similar situation, right? Kind of a not my pants scenario. And you know firsthand how frustrating that is. So I slipped into maladaptive mode and started trying to convince him of the reasons why this was all ridiculous and why he should just talk to me about it. And at this point, he's just staring at me and shutting down. And more or less, he's looking at me like, you know, what the hell is wrong with you? So I caught myself and brought myself back to the right mindset. And I just shut up for a minute. Right? Research also shows that if you feel you're off track, you most likely are. And the best response is just to be quiet. Right? Be quiet and listen, or just allow some silence. Get yourself back on track. So I stopped talking. And then finally I said, okay, I get you don't want to talk about that. And that's fine. What would you like to talk about? And it's funny. He just looked at me and said, just ask me something I can talk about. I realized what he was saying was that in front of the Pakistani intelligence guys, he could not talk about having met with Pakistanis, right? ISI would probably kill him for that. So had I persisted in pushing and trying to convince him, that interview would have been over. Instead, I made a concession, pivoted to things that didn't deal with Pakistani politics, and we talked for several days, and out of it, I generated a lot of good intel. So the point is, the goal of an interview is not to win. And for a moment there, I was just trying to win, right? The goal is always to collect information and to bring us to some broader understandings, right? If I'd persisted in trying to win the argument about the passport, I'd have ended up with nothing. But I'd slipped for a moment to the mindset that had beaten into me 20 years ago. But moving back to an interviewer's mindset, that interview, right, I saved it from the flames I was about to set. So funny thing here is that a couple days later, like unprompted by me, he actually told me everything I needed to know about the trip to Saudi. And I have no idea what changed, but in the end, we got everything we needed. So to start kind of pulling this all together, right? Knowing what drives us and what we really value and believe allows us to be present in an interview, to listen and to key in on the things that matter, and to not react negatively when the discussion gets tense or uncomfortable or frustrating, or even when somebody's verbally attacking us. Right? When we don't react negatively and when we ask the right non-judgmental follow-on questions, we keep the momentum moving forward. And being present allows us to key in on the things that matter to the interviewee and the subtext of what they're trying to tell us, and not just the things that we believe matter. We move out of seeing it from our perspective and to seeing it from their perspective, right? That's the heart of curiosity and ultimately of empathy, seeing it from someone else's perspective. So as Sun Tzu said, if you know yourself, right, and you can read that, setting aside the enemy and battle imagery, as that's not really consistent with an interviewer's mindset. But if you know yourself and the other person, you can be confident in success. So don't just wing it, right? Spend the time knowing it is who you're going to interview. And more importantly, spend a lot of time on introspection and metacognition. Why do I believe what I believe? And why am I thinking what I'm thinking? That allows us for critical emotional regulation in stressful moments. And when we have a solid understanding of the psychology behind effective interpersonal communication, and we've practiced it in difficult situations, we have the confidence to know that no matter what is happening in an interview, no matter how off track it may feel, there's no need to panic. We don't need to bulldoze our way out of it. We can move it forward with the nuance of psychology, and we'll end up where we need to be. And if anybody recognizes that image and know how the bulldozer metaphor relates to it, you get an A today, and I love you as well. Finally, when we're comfortable with ourselves and confident in our abilities, this frees up the cognitive space to allow us to be genuinely curious, right? To move away from anchoring bias and confirmation bias and the like, and to listen for those openings that will lead us to the things we don't know. Right? It'll bring us to asking about the things we didn't even know to ask about. I've talked a lot about interviewers' mindset, and that to me is a critical part of it. Like I said at the beginning, the science part is also critical. The two work together. So if you're not as familiar as you'd like to be with the science, the HIG has done a massive amount of research, and that's available in different places. And CREST in the UK, the University of Lancaster in the UK, has a fantastic website. If you just Google CREST and University of Lancaster, I think it comes up, that is just chock full of a lot of this research as well. So a fantastic resource. And as hopefully it's obvious, I love talking about this stuff. So if anything ever comes up, here's my contact information. Feel free to hit me up. Love talking about it. And with that, I think we still have a lot of time for a conversation.